Ever wondered what really happens when night falls, when the world seems quieter than it should? Some say that the silence of darkness isn't accidental, but a warning, as if nature, in its wisdom, holds its breath, waiting for something that, in its tranquility, would otherwise go unnoticed. Maybe it's just a legend, but that night I wasn't so sure. I was home alone. For many teenagers, this would be the height of freedom. No rules, no schedules, just me, the TV, and a lazy night. But for me, silence was an uncomfortable companion. After the credits of a movie I no longer remember, I got up from the couch and went to the kitchen. The cold light of the fridge illuminated the room as I drank juice straight from the carton. It was one of those hot, sticky summer nights when the air feels heavy, as if it's laden with something more than just moisture. The house was at peace, or at least it seemed that way. I went to the kitchen window and looked out into the garden. Everything was in its usual place. The metal table in the courtyard, the two small trees in the background, and the parasol leaning against the fence. But that night, something bothered me. The shadows seemed deeper, almost solid. I blinked, trying to make out the shapes in the darkness. Everything seemed normal until something made me hesitate. There, near the back fence, was a silhouette, tall, thin, and motionless. My heart raced, but trying to dispel the fear, I forced a laugh. "It must be the parasol," I murmured, trying to shake off the unease. Even so, I couldn't tear my eyes away. Something about that figure felt wrong. Minutes passed, and the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. Logic told me to close the curtains and go to my room, but curiosity kept me there, as if something was calling me to understand what was happening. What was that? I took a deep breath and turned off the kitchen light, trying to hide better. My mind searched for logical explanations. It was just an object, wasn't it? Or maybe it was something else. This doubt followed me as I went up to my room. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew something was different that night, and I still had no idea how much. Summer nights have a peculiar quality. Despite the heat and the gentle breeze rustling the leaves, it's as if the darkness carries an invisible weight. That Saturday in July, around 9:30 p.m., the world seemed to be in absolute silence, but not all its inhabitants were at peace. In a house at the end of a quiet street, a teenager enjoyed his solitude. His parents were away visiting relatives on the coast. He stayed at home not out of obligation but by choice. He'd rather spend his holidays in the city with friends and the family routine than waste weeks somewhere else. He didn't know it, but that night would turn out to be very different from all the others. Outside, the garden was still, like a black and grey painting under the moonlight. The metal table and chairs on the patio were arranged as usual. The trees in the background swayed gently, and the parasol leaned against the fence, standing out with its elongated shape. It was an ordinary scene, but something was there that couldn't be ignored. Something invisible, just waiting to be discovered. Meanwhile, the history of the forest surrounding the neighborhood was a mystery to many. By the end of the 19th century, there were records of strange disappearances in the area, with reports of human figures seen among the trees. Local documents spoke of legends about guardians of the forest, tall, silent figures who watched intruders. Many dismissed these stories as mere folklore, but some, particularly the older residents, swore something inexplicable lurked there. These stories, however, weren't on the teenager's mind. He preferred more practical, logical explanations, but when he saw the tall, motionless figure near the fence, something inside him hesitated. He tried to rationalize, convincing himself the silhouette was just the parasol, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something that didn't make sense. It was 9:45 p.m. when he turned off the kitchen light and approached the window to take a closer look. The silence of the neighborhood seemed amplified. Every small sound, the snap of a branch, the rustling, of leaves seemed louder. He stared at the figure for long minutes, torn between curiosity and fear. Everything indicated it was just an object, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave him. Meanwhile, the forest behind the house remained an enigma, as silent as the garden. At that moment, he didn't know that tonight would lead him to a confrontation with the stories he had never believed. He didn't know that soon the shadows would begin to move, and his understanding of the unknown would be put to the test. The world felt unnervingly still, as if it were holding its breath before something inevitable. And as he climbed into his room, trying to shake off the discomfort, the motionless figure in the garden seemed to merge even more with the darkness. Fear grew without him realizing it. The darkness deepened, shrouded in mystery. The silence, which had once felt unsettling, now seemed to have a presence of its own, heavy with hidden intentions. In the room, the teenager tried to distract his restless mind. But the thoughts of what he had seen in the garden lingered like a shadow that refused to leave. Something was wrong, but he still didn't know how much. That same night, elsewhere, in the city, reports of unexplained events in the forests weren't rare. The area was surrounded by ancient legends. Some spoke of creatures that mimicked human sounds to lure in their prey. Others of entities that tested the courage of those who ventured too far. While these stories were generally considered local, folklore many shared similar elements: silent presences, swift movements, and an overwhelming sense of being watched. That night, something seemed to have stepped out of these stories. Shortly after 10 p.m., the young man decided to return to the kitchen, unable to ignore the unease building within him. He approached the window again, but this time, what he saw took his breath away. The figure that had once seemed like an immovable object was now in a different position. It was no longer just a shadow on the fence. It had leaned in slightly, as if it had come closer. His heart raced. He didn't want to believe it, but logic was giving way in the face of what he was seeing. No matter how hard he tried to justify what he saw, it was impossible to deny that something had moved where it shouldn't have. He stepped back, turned off the lights again to hide better, and tried to observe more closely. Every second seemed like an eternity, and the figure stood there still, yet alive in its silence. At that moment, he did what anyone would. He sought help. He texted his friend Chris, quickly explaining what was happening. "Can you come over now?" he asked. Chris, though skeptical, agreed to come over with a small flashlight. It didn't take long for him to arrive, and the two met in the kitchen. "Do you see that?" asked the host. Chris nodded, but tried to rationalize. "It must be just a plant or some forgotten object in the garden." Still, the doubt remained. They decided to investigate, but without straying too far from the house. They put on their shoes and opened the back door. The air was heavy, and the darkness seemed even thicker. Each step was careful, the lantern shaking as it illuminated the path. But before they could get any closer, the sound of something large moving through the trees stopped them. The figure was no longer by the fence. Panic began to grow. What had once been curiosity now felt like something far more threatening. The flashlight illuminated the empty space, but offered no answers, only more questions. They ran back to the house, locked the door, and hurried upstairs to the bedroom. The sense of security was illusory, but it was all they had.